Well, we've got Stephen in El Paso who has an argument for the existence of God, which I guess is the first thing we need to establish before we can determine whether or not there's a being worth worshiping. How you doing, Stephen?
Good. How are you guys? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about a form of the cosmological argument known as the argument from contingency. Though I didn't want to go with a specific one, meaning I didn't really want to go with Aquinas's or Leibniz's. I just kind of formulated my own. I mean, it kind of goes along the same lines, but I think you would agree, maybe, since it's called the argument from contingency, the first thing that should be done is maybe we should define what we mean by contingent and non-contingent.
Sure.
Okay. I kind of wanted to go off of two definitions, but really I would claim they're the same. And this definition of contingent I'm using is basically from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It states that basically that something is contingent if it exists but could have failed to exist, or it could have been different than what it is. And the reason behind this, I guess, would be if it's possible that X could have failed to exist, then the reason for X's existence cannot be part of its own nature. But it has to be derived from something else, and this is why it would be contingent upon something else. Because if the reason for X's existence was part of its nature, then it would not be possible for X to have failed to exist. Just like if having three sides is part of the nature of a triangle, then it would not be possible to have a triangle fail to have three sides.
Sure. One of the problems right off the bat is that how do you determine whether or not something could have been another way or could have not existed?
Of course. I think philosophers would say something is metaphysically possible if it's conceivable. Conceivable, not necessarily if you can imagine it. I think you can differentiate between conceiving something and imagining something, but I think they would say then if you can't conceive of something, for instance, I can't conceive of a square circle, therefore it's a logical contradiction, it's not an actual possibility.
So the exclusion for that isn't, I wouldn't say is necessarily that you can conceive of it, it's whether or not there's an intrinsic contradiction in there.
Correct.
But the thing is, with definitions of contingency like this, they are pretty much contained within reality. And so we can say, we understand that a coin toss from a fair coin could, land heads or tails. And so we flip it and it lands heads. And within the context of reality, we can say that it is possible that it could have landed tails. But that is an assessment of probability, and not an assessment of the actual fact, because it may be the case that the universe is so deterministic that it is actually impossible for it in that instance to have fallen as anything other than heads. And so it's kind of this provisional contingency. We're talking about these things in sort of fuzzy terms as, if my folks hadn't gotten together, I wouldn't exist. Therefore, my existence is contingent upon my folks. And we can only look at it within that framework. We can't then expand it to the broader framework, because when we do, we have no way to exclude the possibility that all of these things, this chain of contingencies, is in fact non-contingent, that this was the result of determinism in the universe.
Okay. I definitely see what you're saying. Would you then say that we wouldn't want to go with this definition of contingent then, or that maybe you would only concede it tentatively, or? Well,
see, when we're talking about whether or not something's contingent, we have to have a good understanding of the possibilities and talk about it within that scope. And so when you go back to, let's say, or you look at the entirety of the universe, or the formulation of the universe, you don't have enough information to determine whether or not it's contingent or not. Because we have one universe, we don't know of any others, we don't have the ability to explore the origin of the universe in the kind of depth that would allow us to come to the same conclusion as we would for example, my existence or the flip of a coin. And this is where these sorts of things break down.
Well, I completely understand where you're coming from. even theoretical physicist Sean Carroll has said surely that the universe does not exist, and this is jumping ahead to the argument, but surely the universe does not exist out of logical necessity, because we can easily conceive it of having different laws, different fundamental particles, and again, as philosophers would say, if we can conceive it, then it's metaphysically possible. Perhaps it's not physically possible in this universe, otherwise we would have a different universe, but it is metaphysically possible, and I think what we're talking about here would simply be metaphysical possibility and not necessarily physical possibility.
Sure, and I don't disagree with that in any substantive way. My point is that when we're talking about these things, we're talking about the origins of the universe, etc. The metaphysical or philosophical possibilities, which are basically just saying that something is possible as long as it's not logically contradictory and hasn't been demonstrated to be impossible within that framework, don't get us anywhere. Because even if you were to conclude and determine, for example, that the universe was in fact a contingent object, if we view the entirety of the universe as an object, that doesn't tell you what it's contingent upon, because you don't have that information. And so I don't know how you could actually conclude that in the first place. But even if you did, it doesn't get you anywhere.
Okay, so are you saying you don't know how we would go about determining whether the physical universe is contingent, or if the physical universe were contingent, we wouldn't be able to determine what it would be contingent upon?
The latter is the latter is my primary point. I think there may be something in the former as well, but the latter is, if we were to go about determining, and I'm still not completely sure how we can determine that the universe could be contingent, but if we were to determine that, I don't see any mechanism by which we can tell what it's contingent upon. Is it contingent upon a multiverse? Is it contingent upon universe creating pixies? Is it contingent upon a god? Or is it contingent upon some other potential explanation that we haven't even thought of and we have no way of investigating? So it's it gets you to a point, and this is a problem with a lot of versions of the cosmological argument, where even if they were true, even if they turned out to be valid and sound, and the universe had a beginning and was contingent upon something else, they cannot tell you what that something else is.
Okay, I'm not sure I would agree. And I mean, again, Matt, I understand where you're coming from. Whatever the universe would be contingent upon, it would obviously be something so far out of our realm, maybe that we don't have any way of investigating it. But I don't know if that means that we can't cut some of the hypotheses out. For instance, you could say, well, maybe it's contingent upon something else.
How do you cut out the multiverse?
Well, the multiverse would still be all energy, all matter, all space-time, and it is still possible to conceive of all matter, energy, and space-time not existing.
Okay, see,
or for it to have been a different way.
This is the problem with metaphysical contingency, that you're just not going to get anywhere, because the fact that you can conceive of it doesn't mean that it's likely or possible or probable.
I never said it was likely.
So what I'm talking about is, I care about real explanations. I care about truth. Saying that something, basically these arguments are not saying, hey, this is possible or probable or likely. The only thing these arguments are saying is, this is conceivably not impossible. And it's appealing to things that go beyond the natural world. You cannot demonstrate the existence currently of the supernatural. You cannot demonstrate supernatural causation. And so it becomes kind of a, hey, it's possible that this could have some explanation that transcends our local universe. And since that's possible, we can potentially posit what sort of characteristics might be required. And then we can apply those characteristics and say, do those characteristics conform to any concept or idea that we've had, or can we construct a concept and then put all of those ideas in it? In which case, you are basically constructing a sufficient explanation without demonstrating that it's necessary or probable. And so these arguments get nowhere.
Well, I don't know if I'd agree with that, Matt. I mean, you're right, and I mean, we can construct anything that would be sufficient. Even your universe creating pixies would be sufficient And you're right. We need to demonstrate that it's necessary. And
so let's say, for example, that somehow we came down to two. We've narrowed it down to two explanations. Some version of, for example, the Christian God and universe creating pixies. How do you go about determining which one of those is the more probable explanation of the two?
Well, if they are the ground of existence, the ontological foundation of reality, whatever the ontological foundation of reality is, it must be necessary. It must be, and you know, I'm saying it as if it's one thing, but I'm still trying to incorporate your hypothesis here. It would have to be necessary, and if it has to be necessary, its nature, you know, based on the definitions of contingency that I gave, then its nature would have to include the reason for its existence. What this means is that
this is in no way an answer to how to determine which one's more probable.
I'm getting to it. So if we arrive at a necessary existent, we arrive at something whose nature is existence, and it's of its nature to exist. And not only this, but we would arrive at something which could not have been different than what it is.
So I'll make this even easier.
Okay.
Let's say the two possibilities are two identical versions of the Christian God, except that one of them ceased to exist after it created the universe.
I'm sorry, say that again?
There's two possibilities. We somehow narrowed it down to two nearly identical versions of the Christian God, and the only difference between the two of them is that one of them still exists and the other one ceased to exist at the moment of creating the universe.
Again, the latter would not adhere to the definition of necessary.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. Yes, it would.
Because
no. Stop, Stephen.
Stephen. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry.
These two are identical, except that one of them ceased to exist after the event for which it was necessary. So they were both necessary and sufficient at the time of the creation of the universe, and then one of them voluntarily ceased to exist.
I wouldn't agree, Matt. You're misusing the term necessary. Necessary doesn't mean necessary for X. It means it cannot fail to exist.
I'm sorry, but you're using the term in a different context. When we're talking about causation, you find what is necessary and sufficient. When I light a match, there were a number of factors that were necessary and sufficient, but they don't have to continue existing after the event, because we're talking about causation. And you're trying to say that you are moving on to an ontological premise in which this thing necessarily must exist and necessarily must continue existing. By what right do you claim that of those two options, assuming we could even get to those two options, that the correct option is the one that necessarily continues existing instead of the one that stopped?
Because, Matt, the argument from contingency, although we're arguing about things' natures, it is very much epistemological in that we're talking about the explanation of something's nature. So when we're talking about the explanation of something's nature, we're talking about epistemology, not ontology, and therefore not causation. When I say something derives its existence,
I'm talking about causation.
This might be a causation. This might be a form of causation, but that's not the form of necessary that I'm talking about.
And I don't care about the form of necessary that you're talking about. I'm talking about causation, because that's what the cosmological argument is about.
Well,
you avoid the problem of causation by moving on to necessary essence, for which you can't justify anyway. I mean, I've pretty much given way to everything by narrowing it down to two options, neither of which could you demonstrate, only to show this one problem, that even if you could get down to a God, you can't demonstrate that God still exists.
Well, the problem is because we can't agree on our definitions, Matt. If you want to say that these two gods are necessary, then I would say that you're using necessary in a term that I'm not using.
Okay, I've already acknowledged that. I'm talking about it in terms of causation, about what is a necessary and sufficient cause for the origin of the universe.
Because when you have something that is contingent, something must continually uphold it in existence.
No, that's just wrong. My parents don't have to keep having sex to produce me. They just had to do it the one time.
But your parents aren't the only condition for why you exist. One of the reasons you also exist is because you're breathing in.
We're not talking about why something continues to exist. We're talking about how something came into existence.
Okay.
If you're talking about a cosmological argument, you're talking about the origins of the cosmos. Now, if you want to shift to talk about what is it that sustains the cosmos, what is it that is necessary to maintain the cosmos existing, I'm going to reply that I see no reason to think that there's anything other than the existence of the cosmos to sustain it.
Well, Matt, you're correct that I said I was putting forth a version of the cosmological argument, but even though this version is the argument from contingency, my argument was not arguing that the universe was simply created in a past act. And we didn't even get to the syllogism, but the conclusion would have been, therefore, the universe derives its existence from something outside of itself. And this doesn't mean it necessarily had to simply be a past act. In fact, it's very possible that the universe could be eternal, and therefore it didn't necessarily derive its existence in a past act, but is being continually held up in existence. So my
argument is, and how would you demonstrate what it is that's continually holding it up?
Just simply by the fact that a contingent being still requires a necessary being. So you
haven't demonstrated that you haven't demonstrated.
Well, I know, because we're jumping all around the place here, Matt.
It's not my fault, Stephen. You called in about the cosmological argument and you jumped to something else. And every time I raise a point, you're saying, "Oh, I'm talking about something different." Okay, so let's talk about the thing that you're talking about, which is you are arguing essentially that the universe's continued existence must be sustained by, that it is contingent on something outside of the universe. How did you reach that conclusion? That it's continued?
That's what I was trying to get at. So if we form a syllogism,
so get to it.
Premise one, if something is contingent and it derives its existence from something outside of itself. Premise two, and this is the big premise, obviously. This is the premise that I wouldn't expect anybody to take lying down. The universe is contingent. Obviously, that's the big one that would need to be demonstrated. And then premise three, therefore the universe derives its existence from something outside.
So first of all, that's not premise three, that's conclusion. Premise one, premise two, conclusion, not premise three. The other thing is that your premise two, it's worded rather poorly, because you're saying the universe derives its contingency, or the universe is contingent on something outside of it. Okay, but you're not, in this case, you're talking about the universe's continued persistent existence.
Correct.
You're not talking about the origin of the universe.
Correct.
Okay. What makes you think that after a universe has begun, that it is then necessarily contingent in order to persist in its existence?
Can you repeat that, Matt? I'm sorry.
Once a universe has been created, has begun, has come into existence, what justification do you have for saying that it is then contingent on something outside of itself to continue existing? Because hang on.
No,
because one of the things is, if you spin a top, it's not, the motion and everything there. I mean, obviously we're still talking about within the physical universe and the framework, but it's going to spin down, just like our universe is going to spin down to heat death. So if we have an example of this natural universe, which currently exists and will suffer heat death and essentially go to a non-existent state in some context, how do you go about determining that its continued subsistence is contingent on something external?
Because for two reasons, although these might be the same reason. First of all, whether we're talking about at the beginning of the universe or much later on when the universe is existing, it still requires a reason for why it exists even at that particular moment. And so even if you're spinning a top and it's eventually going to fall down, there are still other things that make the top contingent. It's not as if once you spin the top is no longer contingent and it ceases being contingent. Something is continually being contingent. So this is kind of the point I was driving at with your parents. Yeah, your parents gave birth to you.
Yes.
But you're still continually contingent on
yes,
other
my continued existence is contingent upon the physical laws of the universe.
Correct.
Okay.
Does your universe include everything that exists?
Yes, my universe is, I believe I defined it earlier. I would say the universe here.
By your own definition, there's nothing outside of it, so we're done, right?
No, I'm sorry. No, I just misspoke. What I mean by universe. No, and you're completely. You're right to get me on that. I misspoke. What I mean by universe is all energy, matter, and physical laws and space-time.
Okay. So here's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
The way we go about determining that my continued existence is contingent upon the upon the existence of the universe is a matter of evidence. We can explore things beyond me. I can explore the universe. I can understand how I work. I can understand that I need to take in food and energy and process it and all of these other things. That cannot be done for the universe. And yet you are basically arguing that it's necessary without being able to demonstrate that there is anything at all outside of the cosmos. You have no. There's nothing that demonstrates that there's something outside of the cosmos. This is what I talked about earlier about the problem of demonstrating the existence of the supernatural or supernatural causation, is we have no mechanism by which to demonstrate that it even exists or could exist or what exist would mean, because existence is necessarily temporal. And so when time is also encapsulated in the cosmos, and you talk about, for example, some God existing outside of space and time, that no longer makes any sense. So even the language used is problematic, but more than that, there's no way to investigate and confirm this.
Well, I would agree. There's no way to empirically investigate and confirm this. But
then I don't care. Then I don't care.
What can I speak, Matt? But then that would mean that. Would you then agree that, or would you concede that then the only way to attain knowledge is empirically?
I'm not concerned with knowledge. I'm talking about whether or not a claim is rationally supported by argument and evidence sufficient to warrant its belief. I'm not concerned with knowledge or definitions of knowledge. We don't wait till we have knowledge to act. We act in accordance with our beliefs. And I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. And if somebody tells me that I can be rationally justified in believing something that they cannot empirically demonstrate, then they're wrong. You simply cannot be rationally justified in believing those things that cannot be empirically tested and demonstrated.
But Matt, how is that statement not self-refuting, since it is not based on any type of empirical evidence?
It actually is based on empirical evidence. As I pointed out during the debate with Cy, there are things that we must presuppose as a matter of necessity: the primacy of existence, the existence of reality, the logical absolutes. And the reason that we justify these, and there's a number of different epistemological schools of thought on this. I am more in line with found-herentism, I think, which is a mishmash of foundationalism. Okay. And so one of the things is like, an example I given before, if somebody sets a bottle of Coke down on there, I know that all of my senses can be fooled. And so I use them in conjunction to determine the facts about this bottle of Coke. And even though I may be the only mind in the universe because I can't solve hard solipsism, I'm still stuck working in a universe where, as far as I can tell, I'm not the only mind. So I will get those other minds to tell me whether or not they are experiencing and seeing the same thing. That is the process of investigation that I'm talking about, and that is true for saying that my continued existence is contingent on the universe. That type of thinking, that process, skepticism, critical thinking, the foundations of epistemology. I see no mechanism by which we can extend that beyond the universe, beyond the natural world. It's the reason that the scientific method is based not on philosophical naturalism, but methodological naturalism. Because until someone provides a mechanism by which we can investigate, then we cannot come to rational conclusions about it.
Would you say that you are, and I agree with what you're saying about methodological naturalism, would you say that you are a metaphysical naturalist, Matt?
No. Well, it kind of depends. So when you get to metaphysical, oh boy, but we're going way off the rails on a lengthy call here. The nuts and bolts are I'm fine with the idea that the natural world may in fact be all that exists. I recognize it as a matter of practical necessity until someone gives me some other option. I'm stuck dealing with the natural world and only the natural world until someone demonstrates something other than the natural world. But I am not going to assert with certainty or even incredibly high probability that the natural world is all that exists, because that would require me to have knowledge that would necessarily exclude the supernatural. And that's a problem too. You can't necessarily exclude something that you have no mechanism by which to investigate. And that's why I don't tend to identify as a philosophical naturalist.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to clear that up. Okay, so
We're gonna have to sum this up pretty quick because there's other callers and people are starting to fall asleep with our philosophical jargons.
No, that's fine. No, you know what? I think we're not going to agree on a lot here, Matt, and that's fine. You know, we can just agree to disagree. And I'll let the other callers go ahead and take over. And I thank you for letting me kind of.
I really wish I could agree with you, but there's no sense in both of us being wrong.
All right.
Okay.
But feel free to email Stephen. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. You guys have a good day.
Thanks. All right. What do you
Wow.
think, Don?
Wow.
So these are the conversations that I like,
A little
and
too
there
technical for me on the philosophical front, but
there are some people who enjoy them, and there are others
I'm
who
more of a science
are
guy than a philosophy guy, right?
scraping their balls out right now, and I understand that. So we'll go on to other callers.